Prison isn't just punishment, it's survival. Behind bars, violence rules, gangs dominate, and some crimes are so despised that they make killers into targets. For certain criminals, justice didn't end with their trial. Inside, other inmates became judge, jury, and executioner. These are the stories of notorious murderers who thought prison would protect them, but instead faced the most brutal punishment of all. And it begins with a man whose crimes were so twisted that when justice finally caught up to him behind bars, it was delivered in a way no one could have imagined. Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer, a name that still chills anyone who hears it. Between 1978 and 1991, he murdered 17 young men and boys in crimes so twisted that the world could barely comprehend them. Necrophilia, cannibalism, dismemberment. His acts earned him the title of the Milwaukee Cannibal. When Dahmer was finally caught and sentenced to 16 life terms in 1992, many believed prison would be the end of his reign of terror. But inside Columbia Correctional Institution, something unusual happened. Dahmer didn't shrink into the shadows. He mocked people. According to other inmates and guards, Dahmer would joke about his crimes, shaping food into severed limbs, smearing ketchup on his skin to imitate blood. In a place where respect is everything, his morbid sense of humor wasn't just disturbing, it was a death sentence waiting to happen. By 1994, tensions had reached a breaking point. On the morning of November 28th, Dahmer was assigned to a routine cleaning shift alongside two other prisoners, Jesse Anderson, a convicted wife killer, and Christopher Scarver, a man already serving life for murder. The three were left unsupervised for just 20 minutes. It was all Scarver needed. Armed with a steel bar taken from the prison gym, Scarver ambushed Dahmer. He struck him repeatedly, crushing his skull and leaving him barely alive on the bathroom floor. Minutes later, Dahmer was pronounced dead. Anderson was attacked too, and he didn't survive either. When news spread through the prison, some inmates reportedly cheered. To them, Dahmer's gruesome end wasn't a tragedy, it was justice, prison justice. But Dahmer wasn't the only killer who discovered that walls and guards couldn't protect him. Another predator, one who preyed on the most vulnerable, elderly women in their homes, would soon learn the same brutal lesson. Billy Kemmermeer. Billy Kemmermeer seemed at first glance like an ordinary man living in Texas, but behind his quiet exterior hid one of the most chilling crime sprees in recent American history. Between 2016 and 2018, Kemmermeer posed as a maintenance worker or healthcare aide to gain access to the homes of elderly women. Once inside, he smothered them with pillows and robbed them of their jewelry. Authorities believe he may have killed more than 20 women, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in Texas history. His victims were grandmothers, mothers, women who should have been safe in their final years. Instead, their lives were cut short in cold, calculated attacks that left entire families devastated. When Kemmermeer was finally caught and sentenced to life in prison, many hoped it would bring some closure. But inside the Dallas County Jail in September 2023, justice took another turn. One morning, guards found Kemmermeer lifeless in his cell. He had been brutally attacked by another inmate, beaten to death with nothing more than bare hands and sheer rage. The man who had smothered so many defenseless victims had himself been smothered by prison's unwritten law. Predators don't last long. For the families of his victims, his death didn't erase the pain. But for many it felt like a final reckoning, and prison was far from done handing out punishments. The next killer had earned the nickname the Angel of Death, and in the end even his fellow prisoners wanted to see the angel fall. Donald Harvey. Donald Harvey was no ordinary killer. He didn't stalk his victims in the night or hunt strangers. Instead, he earned the name the Angel of Death by targeting the very people who trusted him most. As a hospital orderly in Ohio and Kentucky during the 1970s and 1980s, Harvey claimed he killed as many as 87 patients. Some he poisoned with cyanide, others he suffocated, and a few he simply tampered with their medical equipment until their bodies gave out. Harvey justified his crimes by saying he was ending suffering, but investigators quickly realized his motives were darker and far less merciful. Many of his victims hadn't been terminally ill at all. They had simply crossed his path, By the time he was caught, Harvey had slipped under the radar for nearly 2 decades. In 1987, he finally confessed and was sentenced to multiple life terms. Behind bars, Harvey kept a low profile, but his reputation followed him. Other inmates saw him not as a man of mercy, but as a cowardly predator who preyed on the defenseless. In March 2017, justice inside the prison walls finally caught up with him. Harvey was found badly beaten in his cell at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility. He clung to life for 2 days in a hospital bed before dying from his injuries. The angel of death had been silenced by the very world he thought he could manipulate, and he wasn't alone. Across the ocean in Spain, another killer of the vulnerable, a man who targeted elderly women, would suffer a fate that echoed Harvey's. José Antonio Rodríguez Vega. In the 1980s, the Spanish city of Santander lived in fear of a man nicknamed the Old Lady Killer. José Antonio Rodríguez Vega was a seemingly ordinary construction worker, but behind closed doors, he preyed on some of society's most vulnerable, elderly women who lived alone. Between 1987 and 1988, Vega brutally murdered at least 16 women. He gained their trust by offering help around the house, then strangled them, often leaving their bodies hidden for days before discovery. His crimes shocked Spain not only because of the number of victims, but because of the cold calculation with which he selected them. When Vega was finally arrested and sentenced to over 440 years in prison, many thought justice had been served, but his fellow inmates had a different idea of justice. In October 2002, after more than a decade behind bars, Vega was ambushed in his cell by 2 other prisoners. They beat him savagely with homemade weapons, leaving him unrecognizable. By the time guards arrived, it was already too late. For many in Spain, the news of his violent death felt like a grim but fitting end to one of the country's most despised killers. But prison wasn't finished dealing with monsters. In South Carolina, a small-town strangler known for targeting women would also discover that inside prison walls he wasn't the hunter anymore. He was the hunted. Lee Roy Martin. In the late 1960s, South Carolina was haunted by a predator who came to be known as the Gaffney Strangler. His real name was Lee Roy Martin, a textile worker who hid his monstrous side beneath the mask of an ordinary family man. Martin's crimes were cruel and calculated. He stalked young women, abducted them, and then strangled them to death before leaving their bodies discarded in rural areas. His murders spread fear through the community, with parents keeping their daughters close and police scrambling for answers. But Martin made one fatal mistake. He couldn't resist taunting the authorities. He sent letters to newspapers and law enforcement, bragging about his killings and daring them to catch him. That arrogance ultimately led to his capture in 1968. Sentenced to life in prison, Martin thought his notoriety had earned him a place among hardened criminals. But to his fellow inmates, he was nothing more than a cowardly predator who preyed on the innocent. In 1972, only a few years into his sentence, Martin was ambushed by another prisoner. He was stabbed repeatedly, a frenzied attack that left him dead on the prison floor. The Gaffney Strangler had taken 4 lives on the outside, and inside he lost his own in a flash of prison justice. And while Martin's death was brutal, the next killer's fate was even more savage. His end came not in a quick strike, but in a slow and merciless assault that showed just how far inmates would go to settle scores. Larron Williams. Larron Williams wasn't a household name, but his crime in 1975 left deep scars in Florida. He had broken into the home of a young woman, attacked her viciously, and stabbed her to death in a frenzy of violence. The murder was senseless, cruel, and left investigators stunned by its brutality. When he was finally caught, Williams showed no remorse. A jury sentenced him to life in prison, but in reality, it was a countdown to his own destruction. Behind bars, Williams quickly proved he was just as dangerous inside as he had been outside. He picked fights, threatened other inmates, and carried himself with the same violent arrogance that had defined his crime. In prison, reputation is everything, and his reputation made him a marked man. By 1990, Williams's behavior had caught up to him. One day, another inmate slipped into his cell with a sharpened weapon, and what followed was pure rage turned loose. Williams was stabbed again and again, his body collapsing under the onslaught. Guards rushed to the scene, but it was far too late. The killer who once terrorized a young woman had been silenced by the very world he thought he could dominate. To outsiders, his death was just another statistic in a violent prison system, but to those on the inside, it was proof of the unspoken rule: live by violence, and you'll die by it. And if that wasn't disturbing enough, the next story takes us north to Canada, where one of the country's most infamous killers would discover that his notoriety was also a death sentence. Robert Pickton. Robert Pickton's story is one of the darkest in Canadian history. On the surface, he was nothing more than a pig farmer in Port Coquitlam, British Columbia. But beneath that rough exterior lay a predator who would become one of the country's most notorious serial killers. For years, women vanished from Vancouver's downtown east side, an area where poverty, addiction, and sex work made many especially vulnerable. Families reported them missing, but too often their voices were ignored. Police struggled to connect the disappearances, and for a long time, the truth remained hidden. That truth was Robert Pickton. He lured women to his farm, and what happened there was beyond anything investigators could have imagined. By the time police finally raided his property in 2002, they uncovered a nightmare: DNA evidence, remains scattered across the farm, and allegations that some bodies had been fed to his pigs. Pickton was convicted of killing 6 women, but he once bragged about murdering 49. Authorities suspect the real number may never be known. For the families of his victims, his arrest brought answers, but no comfort. The scale of his cruelty was almost impossible to process. In 2007, Pickton was sentenced to life in prison, but his new reality was far from safe. Other inmates despised him. Even among murderers, his crimes were seen as unforgivable, revolting, and cowardly. Guards knew it too. They placed him in protective custody, isolating him to prevent the inevitable. But isolation couldn't shield him forever. In 2010, another prisoner managed to get close enough to attack Pickton with a homemade shiv. He was slashed, beaten, and left bleeding before guards intervened. He survived, but the message echoed through the prison walls. He would never be safe, not for a single day. For years since, Pickton has lived in fear. Rumors spread constantly that other inmates are planning to finish what was started, and many Canadians believe his story won't end with old age in a cell, but with a final brutal reckoning from those who see themselves as enforcers of prison justice. Because inside those walls, monsters don't inspire fear. They inspire vengeance. And the next case proves it once again. A British inmate, guilty of crimes so twisted they shocked an entire country, would soon learn that his fellow prisoners had no intention of letting him live in peace. Stephen Strutt. Stephen Strutt's name may not be as internationally infamous as some of the others, but in the United Kingdom, his crime shocked the public and sealed his fate behind bars. Strutt was convicted for the brutal killing of a young woman, a crime so senseless and violent that it left investigators and the community horrified. He lured his victim under the pretense of trust, then turned on her with cold brutality. The details of the murder painted a picture of a man with no empathy, no conscience, and no hesitation in inflicting pain. For that, Strutt was handed a life sentence, but prison would prove to be less a punishment and more a trap, one where other men decided to take justice into their own hands. From the moment he arrived, Strutt was marked. Inmates quickly learned what he had done, and the code of the prison world left no room for forgiveness. Crimes against women, especially those as cruel as his, carried a heavy price. Strutt became isolated, shunned, and threatened. He lived under constant tension, knowing that at any moment, someone might strike. That moment came in 1992. Inmates cornered him in a common area, and the attack was as swift as it was merciless. Strutt was beaten and stabbed repeatedly until he collapsed. Guards rushed to intervene, but by then, the damage was irreversible. Strutt was left fatally wounded, his life ending violently at the hands of men who decided he deserved no protection. His death was seen by many not as a tragedy, but as an extension of the justice system. The kind of justice delivered not by judges in robes, but by inmates with nothing to lose. And across the Atlantic in the United States, another killer would soon face a similar fate, a man whose crime shattered a community and who discovered that the prison code would not spare him: John Mansfield. John Mansfield's story is one of cruelty and betrayal. In the late 1970s, Mansfield was convicted of murdering a young woman in Wisconsin, a crime that showed not just violence, but a disturbing lack of humanity. He was sentenced to life in prison, and for many that felt like the only way to keep him from harming anyone else. But prison doesn't forget, and neither do prisoners. From the day Mansfield entered, whispers about his crime followed him. Inmates have their own code, and men who brutalize women often find themselves at the very bottom of the hierarchy. Mansfield quickly became a target. Over time, the threats grew louder, the looks sharper. He tried to keep to himself, but in prison, isolation isn't always enough to stay safe. In 1979, Mansfield's enemies finally struck. Armed with makeshift weapons, a group of inmates attacked him in his cell, stabbing and beating him until he lay bleeding on the floor. By the time guards arrived, his injuries were beyond saving. Mansfield died shortly after, another grim reminder of how prison justice can be far harsher than any judge's sentence. His end shocked no one inside those walls. Inmates saw it as inevitable, the natural consequence of his crime and the unforgiving environment he now lived in. But Mansfield was far from the only one. The next story is even darker. A man whose cruelty toward a child made him the most hated kind of prisoner and sealed his fate behind bars. Subhan Anwar. In the United Kingdom, the name Subhan Anwar is remembered with anger and disgust. His crime was not only violent, it was unbearably cruel. In 2008, Anwar was convicted for the murder of his girlfriend's 2-year-old daughter, a little girl named Sanam. The details of the case were heartbreaking. The child had been beaten, mistreated, and finally suffocated by Anwar. The brutality of the crime horrified the nation, the idea that a grown man could inflict such suffering on someone so small and defenseless. When the trial ended, Anwar was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 23 years. For the public, it was justice, but inside prison, it was only the beginning. Inmates have their own hierarchy, and crimes against children place a man at the very bottom. From the day he entered, Anwar was branded. To many prisoners, he wasn't just an inmate, he was a target. For a time, guards kept him under protection, knowing the risk. But protection doesn't last forever. In February 2013, Anwar's fellow inmates finally caught up with him. They cornered him in his cell and strangled him with bedsheets, leaving him lifeless before guards could intervene. The same method he had used to end the life of a child became the method of his own death. For many, it was a grim kind of symmetry, the ultimate example of prison's code of justice. Anwar's cruelty had come full circle, and it had destroyed him. And across the ocean in California, another predator, this time a cold-blooded serial killer of young women, would soon learn that even his darkest secrets couldn't protect him behind bars. Thornis Christiansen. Thornis Christiansen was the kind of killer who hid in plain sight. Born in Denmark but raised in California, he was, on the surface, quiet and unremarkable. But behind that ordinary exterior was a predator with dark compulsions. In the late 1970s, Christiansen targeted young women in Santa Barbara and Los Angeles. He would offer them rides, sometimes from college campuses or busy streets, then lure them into isolation. There, his true nature revealed itself. He shot and killed at least 4 women, and in some cases he returned to their bodies to commit unspeakable acts. For a time, Christiansen lived a double life, attending college courses, working odd jobs, even socializing with friends, all while carrying the weight of murder on his conscience. But eventually his pattern caught up with him. A 5th intended victim escaped and later spotted him in public, leading to his arrest in 1979. Christiansen was sentenced to life in prison, but inside, his calm demeanor couldn't save him. Other inmates discovered who he really was, and his reputation quickly spread. The fact that he had preyed on young, defenseless women sealed his fate. On March 30, 1981, less than 2 years into his sentence, Christiansen was attacked by another inmate in the prison's exercise yard. He was stabbed repeatedly and left to bleed out on the ground. By the time guards intervened, Thor Nys Christiansen, the quiet student who had lived a double life as a killer, was dead at just 30 years old. His end was swift, violent, and, to many, symbolic. The predator who stalked women had himself been hunted down, but Christiansen wasn't the only one marked for death. Another inmate, notorious not only for killing, but for mutilating himself in shocking ways, would also find that prison justice could be more terrifying than anything he had ever done. Rufe Perceval. Rufe Perceval's story is one of the most disturbing in the history of American prisons, not just because of what he did on the outside, but because of what happened once he was locked away. Convicted of multiple murders in the 1930s, Perceval was sent to serve his time in some of the toughest prisons in the United States, including the infamous Alcatraz. But unlike many other killers, Perceval's torment wasn't limited to what other inmates did to him. He became his own worst enemy. Inside Alcatraz, Perceval's behavior grew increasingly erratic. Isolated, hated by other inmates, and living under constant pressure, he reached a breaking point. In one of the most shocking acts of self-destruction ever recorded, Perceval reportedly chopped off several of his own fingers with a hatchet, right in front of guards and other prisoners. He screamed that he couldn't take it anymore, that the prison had driven him mad. The gruesome incident sealed his reputation. To other inmates, he was no longer just a killer. He was unstable, dangerous, and broken. That reputation followed him everywhere he went, making him an easy target. Prisoners tormented him, mocking his self-mutilation and treating him as an outcast. Eventually, Perceval's enemies caught up with him. Beaten and left for dead, his life inside became a slow-motion collapse, the product of both prison violence and his own unraveling mind. His story became a grim reminder that prison doesn't just punish the body, it destroys the mind. But Perceval wasn't the only one who fell victim to the brutal hierarchy of prison life. The next case takes us to Boston, where a killer's terrifying crimes against women would eventually catch up with him behind bars. Albert DeSalvo. Albert DeSalvo's name is etched into American crime history as the Boston Strangler. In the early 1960s, his reign of terror gripped the city. One by one, women were found dead in their own homes, strangled with items like scarves, belts, or nylon stockings. The killings spread fear through Boston as women locked their doors, barred their windows, and wondered if they might be next. DeSalvo confessed to 13 murders, though to this day, debate lingers about whether he acted alone or if others were involved. Regardless, his name became synonymous with predatory violence. By the time he was arrested, he was already one of the most hated men in the country. In 1967, DeSalvo was sentenced, not directly for the stranglings, but for a series of sexual assaults. He received life in prison, and while the courts had not formally convicted him for the murders, the other inmates knew exactly who he was. Inside the walls of Walpole State Prison, DeSalvo was a marked man. Some prisoners loathed him for his crimes against women, while others sought the twisted glory of being the one who killed the Boston Strangler. In November 1973, that moment came. DeSalvo was found stabbed to death in his cell, his body riddled with wounds. The attack was so brutal that guards and investigators knew instantly it was personal. To this day, no one has been officially charged with his murder, but most believe it was a calculated hit carried out by fellow inmates who wanted to make an example out of him. For many in Boston, his death felt like a dark form of closure. The man who had turned their city into a place of fear had finally faced the same terror inside prison walls. But if DeSalvo's end was shocking, the next case was even more infamous, involving a powerful crime boss whose empire once ruled a city, only for him to be beaten beyond recognition in a prison cell. James Whitey Bulger. Few criminals carried the kind of reputation James Whitey Bulger did. For decades, he ruled Boston's underworld as the feared leader of the Winter Hill Gang. He built an empire on extortion, racketeering, drug trafficking, and murder, all while cultivating an image of a man untouchable by law. But behind the myth was a darker truth. Bulger lived a double life, not only as a gangster but as an FBI informant. For years, he fed information to federal agents while eliminating rivals, using law enforcement as a shield to protect his empire. When this secret finally came to light, it destroyed his reputation among criminals and made him one of the most despised figures in prison culture, a rat. In 2011, after 16 years on the run, Bulger was finally captured in California. He was tried and convicted of 11 murders among many other crimes and sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. At 89 years old, he entered prison as a legend, but also as a marked man. In 2018, Bulger was transferred to USP Hazleton in West Virginia, a prison notorious for violence. Within hours of his arrival, inmates moved in on him. Guards later found Bulger beaten so badly he was almost unrecognizable. His attackers had used padlocks stuffed into socks as weapons, smashing his face and head until he was dead. The brutality of the attack shocked the nation, but inside prison, it was no surprise. To inmates, Bulger wasn't just a gangster. He was a killer of women, a manipulator, and worst of all, an informant. His death was seen as inevitable. The man who once ruled Boston's streets had met his end in a filthy corner of a prison cell, beaten beyond recognition by men who had nothing left to lose. But Bulger wasn't the only one to discover that power and reputation mean nothing once the cell door closes. Long before his time, another prisoner, a young man of privilege whose crime shocked America, would learn that even wealth and status can't protect you when prison justice decides your fate. Richard Loeb. In the 1920s, the murder of Bobby Franks shocked America not just for its cruelty, but for who carried it out. Richard Loeb and Nathan Leopold were wealthy, privileged university students from Chicago. Brilliant, well-educated, and from influential families, they believed themselves so intelligent that they could commit the perfect crime. Their plan was chilling. They kidnapped 14-year-old Bobby Franks, a boy who lived in their own neighborhood, and brutally murdered him. Then they attempted to cover it up, convinced their social standing and intellect would shield them from suspicion. But arrogance was their downfall. Police pieced together the evidence, and both men were arrested. The case became known as the crime of the century. At trial, the nation was transfixed. How could 2 young men with every advantage in life choose to kill, simply to prove they could get away with it? Their lawyer, Clarence Darrow, saved them from the death penalty with a legendary defense, and instead, they received life sentences. In prison, Richard Loeb's arrogance never disappeared, but neither did the hatred of fellow inmates. His wealth and notoriety made him a target, and his crime against an innocent child ensured he would never be safe. On January 28, 1936, Loeb's story came to a brutal end. He was attacked by a fellow prisoner with a straight razor. Slashed dozens of times, Loeb bled to death on the prison floor at just 30 years old. The so-called perfect crime had led not only to the destruction of an innocent life, but to Loeb's own violent demise. And his story is just one more reminder that inside prison walls, the past never stays buried, and justice often comes in the most brutal form imaginable. And if you thought these deaths were shocking, on your screen right now you'll find the story of killers so twisted they fed their victims to their own pets, and another about murderers who escaped prison, only to kill again.